winning a Nobel Prize for economics has to be the pinnacle of one's career, and a salient moment, to say the least.
The question I'm asked most around the world by everybody is, how did you find out?
But Simon Johnson's story seems extra special because he appeared to be hearing the news from the father of economics himself.
I woke up at my usual time, which is about 6 a.m., and I could see from my phone that something was going on, but it didn't quite make sense. It was a bit disorienting. Oh, and by the way, in some fields, they prank each other on Nobel Prize Day. They call people who may have won, and people fall for it, and there's all kinds of stories. Anyway, so I'm looking at this thing saying, I don't know if this is real, what's going on here? And then the phone does ring, and I answer it, and I can see that it's a number from Stockholm. And the guy says, I'm calling from nobelprize.org. And he said, my name is Adam Smith. I thought, that works. Adam Smith just called me to give me the Nobel Prize. That works. My name's Simon Johnson. I'm a professor at MIT in the Sloan School of Management. And in 2007, 2008, I was the chief economist at the IMF.
Johnson is also a co-author, along with Daron Acemoglu, of Power and Progress, which studies the link between technology and prosperity. He was invited back to his old stomping ground by IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva to talk about the book and his Nobel Prize-winning research on institutions and prosperity.
So what is the main message for those of us here who work in research on AI, pro-workers AI? What is...
The technology, big new technologies and AI, which is a perfect example, perhaps even the most extreme example, can go either way. They can either favor a few people and make them immensely wealthy, or they can favor a much broader mass of people, and including with regard to education. So AI could really make less educated people much more productive. Mm-hmm. And by being more productive, particularly if we have a strong overall demand for labor, we would expect their wages to rise and other good outcomes to follow. But if any new technology, and we go through a lot of them in the last 1,000 years, if any new technology only favors a few people and actually perhaps removes opportunity from less educated people, you can have long periods of time in which the headline numbers might look great, but the inequality, I don't actually think the problem is inequality per se. I think the problem is people being left behind or even being pushed down. That's what makes people really angry. If inequality came with everyone rising...
So I'm going to start with maybe your work on institutions. And having read some of your research, I've come to realize that we, or at least most people, myself included, use that word institutions rather loosely, and that the institution that we're sitting in now, and the one across the street, the World Bank, don't necessarily represent this concept that you've studied so deeply. So define for us institutions in the context of your research.
Well, you're quite right that the word institutions is used by different people in different contexts. What interests us is the sort of historical literature and analysis and discussion around what are the rules of the game in the political and economic system. So, to go back in history, when people were trying to write constitutions, where they're thinking about, okay, we have a king, we don't like our king, what comes after the king, they were talking about rules of the game, what's accepted by people, what's legitimate. And I think there's a political sphere, which is where democracy, for example, has evolved and flourished for a long time. And then there's the economic sphere, which of course is about property rights and about investment and about the private sector development. And a lot of the interesting discussions around institutions today are how these two pieces, the economic piece and the political piece, interact and intersect.
And so were you surprised that this work on institutions was recognized to the extent that it has been, by the Nobel Foundation?
Well, I was surprised and delighted to get a Nobel Prize this year, or in this cycle. We received the prize in December 2024. When we did the work, we knew these were big questions. We knew these were questions that were sort of up in the air, that people had made progress on, but we felt there was some unanswered space there. And we were quite gratified to get attention at the beginning. But of course, any work that has impact is also controversial. There's a lot of back and forth. I mean, we wrote a couple of papers that are very highly cited, but probably 20 other papers defending things, expanding things, examining counter arguments. So that was exciting, and that was really fascinating from my own perspective. And then other people started to pick up the work and started to use it. And then we knew we were having some lasting impact. But winning a Nobel Prize, I mean, that's beyond icing on the icing on the cake.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you have these two types of institutions, as you described there. one more about private contracts, the other about private property rights. How do they differ in terms of how they play into the economy? Like, how do they play into the dynamics of the economy?
Well, this is something I looked at actually in my early work, which was in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union after the collapse of communism, because it was clear that private contracting could get around some of the problems that were caused by a weak state, by weak property rights, by a lot of corruption. So private individuals and firms could make deals among themselves. But it was also clear that there were real limits to that. You couldn't make big investments. You were always going to be vulnerable to some bureaucrat coming after you. And it was going to distort the economic recovery. It did distort the economic recovery, for example, most intensely in the former Soviet Union. So I think property rights, which arise from an assertion by the state that there are a set of property rights, the property rights are allocated in the following ways. You can buy and sell property rights. You can have a clear title to property. Those are really fundamental and essential if you want to have a modern economic prosperity. So contracting is helpful, but property rights are really what everyone needs to establish.
And do you think in that context, our institutions, over the years of studying them, do you find that they've kept up with the times, to the extent they're still effective in doing what they should be doing?
Oh, sure. Institutions still matter, and places with better institutions are still more prosperous. And the places with better institutions have managed more or less to hold on to them, although there are some controversies, obviously, today, including the United States. What's striking and I would say disconcerting is despite the attention and the generally shared view that institutions matter and better institutions, less corruption is helpful for economic development, for example, over the past 20 years, we've seen some improvement in places with weaker institutions, lower income, but we haven't really seen much convergence. So places that were very corrupt when we studied them in the 1990s are still relatively quite corrupt today. And that accounts, in our view, for a big part of why countries, poorer countries, have not managed to converge to the income levels of higher income countries.
So I'm just curious, what drew you into this field of study? There are so many things out there in the world of economics.
So I got my PhD in 1989 from MIT, and I'd worked on inflation and high inflation, hyperinflation with Stanley Fischer and Rudy Dornbusch, who were two, obviously very famous macroeconomists. And economics in those days was quite theoretical, model-driven. I was interested in real-world experiences. I wrote a lot of my thesis on economic history, hyperinflation of Germany and the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And in casting around what to do after the PhD, there was a postdoc available at Harvard where you could work on a particular part of the world. And I wrote to them and said I wanted to work on the rising inflation in the Soviet Union, which seemed like an interesting, somewhat bizarre topic. Yeah. But this was 1989, of course. And after I got the postdoc, first of all, Poland got a government run by Solidarity, and I worked with them starting in 1989, a lot more in 1990. The Berlin Wall fell. Right. And I went to work in Eastern Europe on macroeconomics, high inflation, and credit, and what was happening to the banking system. So fairly standard macro financial topics. But I quickly found that what was happening in that sphere was not satisfactory to explain either the depth of the economic recessions and crises these people faced, but also the way in which recovery was beginning to map itself out. And I was drawn towards a careful study of the private sector, including in Gdansk in Poland and other parts of the region. I wrote a book on that with a colleague of mine at Harvard Business School, then at Harvard Business School, Gary Loveman. And that opened one door for me, but there was still this question. And I worked a lot at that time in Poland and in Ukraine. In Poland, the private sector was getting its act together. They were sorting things out. They were making investments. You could see the economy coming back. In Ukraine, there was a lot of entrepreneurship. There were a lot of people looking to find a better way of organizing their lives and their economic activities. But they weren't making as much progress. Why? What was the problem? What was the difference between Poland and Ukraine? How did that fit in the broader context? What was holding them back in the former Soviet Union? And that pulled me towards understanding corruption. I worked on that initially with Danny Kaufman, who was then at the World Bank. He was the World Bank resident representative in Kyiv, actually. We worked on that together, and we began to think about the unofficial economy together. And that led me to understand and think about issues around property rights and around the political systems that either produce viable, functional property rights systems or that fail to produce them and result in predatory states and mass amounts of corruption.
Wow. I mean, your timing was perfect. You couldn't have chosen to study the topic at a better time in history. So I read something recently about, you were talking about your time at the IMF in the mid-2000s when you were a chief economist, as you said earlier. And you said that, institutions were discussed at the time as something that often encouraged, but more often impeded sustainable prosperity. So how does that work? Institutions working against sort of long-term economic goals. How does that happen?
Well, I think the primary way in which you see it in the daily work of the IMF is in the form of corruption. When governments don't do what they say they want to do, when there's items in the budget that are misspent.
Right.
I think you can see it in other places as well, including in just in excessive taxation or an administration of tax and regulation that's burdensome on the private sector. And of course, in many places, we see it as insecure property rights. You can't, if you're born in a certain part of society or a certain geography, you can't get secure title to your home. You can't get secure title to a company. You're preyed upon by either malevolent private sector people or people in the government who have government roles who are equally or even worse in terms of their attitudes and behaviors.
So that plays in, once that starts, it sort of, it makes it more difficult to apply economic policy, I guess, in these countries where they can eventually see growth.
Absolutely. Look, I think what we're talking about is economic policy. And I would say the problem that the IMF faces, and to some extent the World Bank, is that these organizations were designed and built for places that had fundamentally pretty good institutions. Because remember, the original design was, and the concern was rebuilding Europe, getting Japan back on its feet. Economic development became an issue much more as countries became independent, as the European empires fell apart. So when you look at Western Europe, the history of Western Europe over the past 200 years or since World War II, they built democracy. They established private property rights. They had, of course, some massive and really tragic detours, including under the Nazis in Germany. But the fundamental institutions were there. And so macroeconomic policies, including exchange rate policies, budget policies, monetary policies, that you could build on that solid foundation. But when it came to a lot of these former European colonies, and some other countries, but former European colonies, I think it's pretty clear, they were run by the Europeans in a, there was the variety of strategies were applied, but many of them were quite predatory and quite extractive by the Europeans relative to the local people. And when these countries became independent, it was very hard for them and not a natural thing to suddenly adopt West European type institutions, because those took centuries to build. Mm-hmm. And I think the IMF and others who've tried really hard to help these countries are dealing with milieus and contexts and historical legacies that are not amenable to improvement through standard macroeconomic tools. And I think this is, I don't think this is rocket science. I don't think it's new. I think it's understood by people who've been at the IMF for a long time. But I think it's worth articulating and worth thinking about how to do better.
So it brings me to your latest book, which you have sitting right in front of you, Power and Progress, a book where you and Daron Acemoglu actually challenged this assumption, especially in economic circles, that technology equals progress. So why did you think it was important to sort of put that out there at this moment? And I got to say, the timing of the book couldn't have been better. Why did you think it was an important topic to put out there today?
Well, this is obviously the age of AI and artificial intelligence. And there are great claims being made for the improvements that will permeate all of human societies as a result of making computers and algorithms more potent and more able to do thinking for us. And we think that is possible. It could happen. But we're also, based on our reading of history and our thinking about the theory of economics as well, that it is not necessarily the case that improving technology, making technology more productive, expanding the capabilities of some people necessarily translates into an improved standard of living for everyone. So it can, it should, we want it to. That's what we work on, trying to push it. But if you look at the vision of a lot of big tech, it is likely to, and I think currently more intensely focused on improving the capabilities of people like themselves. So these are highly educated people. They're mostly white people. They're mostly men. They have a certain view of the world. They have a certain view of what they want technology to do for them. And it's natural that they would be drawn to, and they have a view of where the market is, right? Where's the money?
Right.
Well, what are people willing to adopt, either as early adopters or as the main market? And it's quite natural that they would be pulled towards inventing things that favor that vision. And our book is an attempt to say, well, how about we put some alternative visions on the table? How about we think about other ways to develop and use technology, including AI? And let's look at what's happened in the past when we've either had technology that's been, for various reasons, more tilted towards raising the productivity of less educated people, or more tilted towards boosting the productivity primarily of highly educated people. Because that drives whether you have a widening of job market outcomes, higher income people, higher educated people do better, or a lot better, and whether you sometimes see more of a convergence in outcomes with lower income people doing better at the same time as the overall economy does well.
Mm. And so essentially you're warning against the risks associated with handing over the tech agenda to some very rich people. What do you think the consequences are of that, where a few people are driving this technology agenda, which has such a huge impact on how economies develop?
So The Economist magazine had an interesting piece recently where they reacted, I think in part to President Biden's parting remarks. Mm-hmm. And he said, watch out for the technology oligarchy. And The Economist said, I think not unreasonably, well, look, the US is a big country. There's lots of different interests. You couldn't possibly have an oligarchy running the country. And I think that's true, perhaps, hopefully, in some traditional definitions. But if you think of oligarchy, if you think of the vision, what we call the vision oligarchy, who controls the vision for what technology can be and should be? I mean, I think we can agree we're in the middle of an AI boom. I think when you talk to people about contrast, for example, between the US and Europe, right now they say, well, look, US is inventing all this technology. There's a lot of investment going there, a lot of capital going there, a lot of talent. Europe doesn't have the same thing going on. All right, so the AI is driving a lot of the conversation. But what is AI? What do you want from AI? What is being built with AI? Yeah. That's a vision. And visions at the leading edge of technologies that are rapidly changing. AI is not the only one. Also biotech, life extension, improvement in quality of life. These are also important technological changes. But AI is in the driving seat at the moment. And the visions behind AI are incredibly important. And I think this is terrain that should be contested. I think people should understand what the stakes are. They should realize that it is not necessarily a good idea to put all the big decisions in the hands of a few people, particularly when those few people have their own particular individualistic lens. This is not there's nothing ad hominem or anti-particular people here. I think all of us have our own lenses and perspectives, but do you want 1 or 2 or 10 people to be driving this, or do you want a broader social conversation and more engagement?
So do you see institutions being part of the solution, perhaps?
Yes, and I tried to explain this in my Nobel lecture, and I think that was a useful exercise forcing me to answer that question, because the work on institutions was done 25, 20, 15 years ago. Yeah. And since then, I've been much more engaged, and Daron and I have been much more engaged on the sort of technological side of things and thinking about these technology strategies. And I think that the point about institutions is 2 or 3-fold. First of all, you need good institutions in order to be a player, right? So why is the technology being driven by the United States? Because we built really good institutions over time. Secondly, that is going to shape and provide context, and the way that democracy operates can have an impact and should have an impact. But digital technology has undermined our ability to have reasoned debates. I mean, shouting at each other over social media, over the internet, is not the same as getting together and finding common ground, right? So the technology has begun to undermine the institutions to some degree. Yeah. And I think the big concern is that if we continue down the road of widening inequality, particularly a version of inequality in which the less educated people are left behind, or feel left behind, or I think are left behind, that feeds into anger and a form of populism that we've seen in many other countries. I think many people who study Latin America would say that's been their experience for the past 150 years. We didn't have that in the US in the 20th century, or the first 2/3 of the 20th century, primarily because the middle class grew up and wages rose for a lot of people. People at the top end did really well, by the way, but inequality was not the driving characteristic of the post-World War II American economy. Since 1980, that has changed. And I think the concern we have is that AI, which is made possible by our institutions, is pulled in a direction that undermines the democracy, causing either the institutions to have some sort of systemic issue, or just to become really tilted away from being relatively more inclusive towards being relatively or even extremely extractive. So a few people get all the value, all the power, all the income, and everyone else is not just left behind, but actually pressed down in terms of their opportunities, their incomes, how they can provide for their families and the prospects of their children.
And beyond that, with this technology, the advancement of technology going so quickly, and with so few countries actually owning the technology, do you worry that inequalities between countries are growing, in terms of where they stand in the global economy?
Yes. It's not new, right? Since really the advent of industrial technology, it has been the case that a few places have led the way, inventing new machines, inventing new means of communication, new means of transportation, and everyone else in the world is some sort of taker in that market. The technology is provided to you. Now, you could go off and invent your own, and the U.S. did this in the 19th century. The U.S. moved from being a country that received technology from Britain to a country that invented technology. Think about railroads, for example. Right. Think about early telegraph and telecommunications. So the U.S. actually shifted its position. That's possible. And I think China has shifted its position also. China was a recipient of Western technology, I think we can all agree, in the 1980s, for example. Now it is pushing into global markets quite sophisticated products in terms of consumer electronics, in terms of cars, and of course AI as a potential contender. So you can change where you sit in the global division of labor, but that doesn't happen very often. Typically, you're receiving technology, you're adopting it. And in the 1960s and 70s, there was a literature, I think quite insightful literature on so-called appropriate and inappropriate technology. The basic idea was rich countries invent stuff that's good for them, then they sell it to the world. They have economies of scale and other advantages. You buy it into low-income countries, but it's designed for a high-income place and a place where labor is quite expensive, and replacing labor at the margin is relatively more attractive. But you bring that to a lower-income country where labor is cheap, you should want to develop more opportunity for cheap labor, but the technology available from the world is capital-intensive. And I think that has been a problem for quite a long time in many places. So now, in the best data that we have available, it looks like, and this is without China in the calculation, because we don't actually know how much is being spent on AI in China. So leaving China to one side, the world ex-China, 95% of the money being spent on AI development is in the US, 3% in Europe, and 2% in the rest of the world. So you can see that's even more skewed. And of course, within the US, it's not everyone, right? It's not across the board. It's a few people driving that calculation. And it's also interesting and striking that there's a lot of money around the world going into AI in the US, and there's a lot of talent around the world, tremendous computer science talent in Europe, Europeans flocking to the United States to work on AI. So the winner-take-all dynamic is even more extreme at this moment than I think we've seen probably ever in modern technological revolutions.
You're not painting a pretty picture. So given all you said, how do we instill some democracy into our technological evolution and make sure things like AI actually work to the betterment of society?
Well, that's the question we work on, and we have a center at MIT called Shaping the Future of Work, where we're engaged on that with technologists, with companies, with governments to the extent they want to talk about it. I think that the key point is to first recognize the situation, which is what we're talking about. The second is to find alternative paths for investment, alternative priorities, people who can actually push technology in this, what we call pro-worker direction. Boosting the productivity of people without a lot of education, I think, is absolutely the key in the United States and around the world. And there are lots of people who have ideas for this. And I think to the extent that AI can be pulled in a direction that's empowering and that's adapted to individual circumstances, and where people with less education feel empowered and investments follow, could be private sector investments, could be government investments, that is going to be helpful. Whether that's enough remains to be seen. And of course, the global tech industry, so-called big tech, is having a moment right now, a moment of unparalleled power, prestige, and access. And hopefully that comes with a sense of responsibility and a sense of if you break it, you own it. But I think we can also worry about that and debate that and watch it and attempt to put some guardrails around those activities. I do think we're in a phase somewhat similar to what we saw with finance in the early 2000s, which I had a ringside seat, of course, for the crisis and the build-up to the crisis of 2008, in which a lot of deference is given to the quote-unquote smartest guys in the room, and bad things happen. I would like to avoid those bad things if possible, but I think also reacting to them, being ready with policies and safeguards and ways to persuade people that they need to be more careful. I think those things are going to be needed.
It'll be interesting to see how all this plays out in the coming months and years. Simon Johnson, a former chief economist here at the IMF and Nobel laureate. Congratulations and thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Simon Johnson won the 2024 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on institutions and prosperity. He shares the award with James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu, who's also co-author of his latest book, Power and Progress, which is available in 20 languages. Go to imf.org to learn more about the impact of technology on economies and a whole lot more of other unique economic research on the inner workings of the global economy. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts or the platform of your choice. I'm Bruce Edwards. Thanks for listening.